So this is the actual
As I
agenda
pick it.
here.
Yes, this is the
Okay.
All right, we are calling the Historical Preservation meeting of May 21st, 2024 to order. I will commence with roll call. Committee Member Bedard?
Here.
Pull the mic closer to you.
Here. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee Member Mead? Here. Committee Member Hunter Copper?
Here.
Okay. Let the record show Chair Rivera and Committee Member Corrales are absent today. All right. Moving on to agenda finalization, we do have a change to the agenda. We are going to be electing a chair pro tem, right?
The chair pro tem essentially will be serving as the parliamentarian running the meeting today in the absence of a chair and a vice chair.
Okay, so I will call a motion to. Sorry.
Do we have a motion to appoint a mayor pro tem chair, or I'm sorry, a pro tem chair for this meeting?
I make a motion to appoint Danielle as our pro tem chairman.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
I accept.
So now we'll have you guys go ahead and put that into motion on your screen. So we'll have Charlotte make the motion and, I'm sorry, Committee Member Charlotte make the motion and Committee Member Bedard make that second. Because you just hit it. So the motion carries to elect Committee Member Mead as the mayor, I'm sorry, I have the mayor stuck in my head, as the pro tem chair for this meeting.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda is public comments. This is the opportunity for members of the public to comment on any items not appearing on the regular agenda. Because of restrictions contained in California law, the Historic Preservation Committee may not discuss or act on an item not on the agenda, but may briefly respond to statements made or ask a question for clarification. The chair may also request a brief response from staff to questions raised during public comment, or may request a matter be agendized for a future meeting. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes. Do we have any public comments?
There are no members of the audience, so we have no one wishing to
Okay.
speak.
So the next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes.
Okay.
Does anyone have any changes for the minutes?
There are no changes to the minutes.
Do any committee members have any changes they would like to see on the minutes?
No.
Charlotte?
No.
Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes.
I wasn't here, so I don't believe I can approve them.
I will
Is
second.
that correct? So I need to abstain, correct?
Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the question would be, did you review the minutes?
Okay, so I can do
Did you
that.
watch, did
Sure.
you watch the last meeting?
I did.
So you would be not approving them, but more or less you're accepting them for your purpose. But if you reviewed the minutes and you were okay with the minutes, then you can vote on them.
All right, then if it's already second, or
Yes.
if it's already second, then I vote aye.
Okay, the motion is passed.
Yes, let the record show a motion was made by Committee Member Hunter Copper, seconded by Committee Member Mead. Motion carries all ayes.
Great. So the next item on the agenda is the outline for Historic Preservation Ordinance Review. At a previous meeting, we had requested this, and I know the staff put together a report. So Andrew, would you like to?
I'll turn this quickly over to Cynthia Schultz. Cynthia Schultz has prepared the staff report and will be leading this discussion.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, committee members. I'm Cynthia Schultz, Associate Planner. It's good to be here tonight. So as you have in front of you, item for discussion, staff heard at the previous Historic Preservation Committee meeting, some concerns over the ordinance as well as over the application form. So I did a little bit of research and looked for some resources. The California Office of Historic Preservation website.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can you speak into your mic?
Yeah. Lean a little bit forward.
Closer.
There we go. How's that? Is
Perfect.
that better?
Thank you.
All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
So the California Office of Historic Preservation website includes many resources. Among them is this Drafting Effective Historic Preservation Ordinances document, which is included in your report. I've referred to it as tab 14 just because it's shorter that way. So it was created as a manual for California local governments to use to draft their own ordinances, but because we already have an ordinance, what I did is I went through it, looked at the elements. There are 9 key elements within that tab 14 that they suggest to have included in an ordinance. There are 9 key elements. I looked at those 9 key elements in light of the ordinance that we do have and reviewed those, made comments, suggestions. Of course, this is all for your consideration and discussion, but I wanted to provide a little bit of background and maybe some framework for you to consider in moving forward with any amendments or recommendations that you might make, particularly because, as you will also have on the agenda this evening, is modifications to the existing application form. Because the application form is proposed to incorporate the criteria which are part of the definitions in the ordinance, it makes sense that if you're going to make modifications to those criteria, to do that conversation first. So with that all said, the other thing that I think is important to note is that the Office of Historic Preservation in California as well as in Colorado, which is where I have my experience previous to this, they're very concerned about making sure that all of the ordinances, regulations, what we value here locally remains local, and that they're not a oversight body, they're not a governing authority, they're really more of a resource. So it really is about what we want to preserve, what's important to us, what's important to City Council, to our community, our neighbors, and to the Historic Preservation Committee as well. So I wanted to point that out. And then I think the last thing is that making sure that your purpose meets and aligns with what your values are. It was written rather recently, but to make sure that your purpose aligns with where you're going, where you're aiming, and then build from there. So I think that's it. Again, this is really just for guidance. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'm here to be a resource. Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting together this document, because the attached document that you actually pulled from is extensive. So I really appreciate you going through and summarizing and kind of pointing out where there might be things we want to discuss. Do you suggest that we kind of go through your individual points, kind of, because there's 9, like you said, it seems like maybe we should just go one by one?
You know, it's up to you all how you'd like to do it. If you've already reviewed it and you have talking points that you'd like to discuss, that's wonderful. We could go through it individually. I just prepared it again, in light of how I was interpreting it, and I'm happy we can go through it whichever way you prefer.
I would like to understand Section 4 a little bit more. I'm fine if we want to go over line by or point by point, but Section 4 is something I'd like to understand a little more deeply.
Certainly. I thought that one might be of interest. This is a key area, as it says in the report. It is key area, and this was key area in previous experience, so I would guess that this is probably pretty common for most preservation committees. So one of the things that is noted in here is procedures and criteria for designation of historical resources. So that's what point 4 is. Again, the reason I wanted to point out that Office of Historic Preservation is very keen on making sure that items stay local, focused on what's local. What is your period of significance? Is there a specific period of time? We have multiple sort of phases in our history that were significant in time. There are numerous individuals, there's some areas that are significant. So really looking at it locally, coming to some sort of an understanding of what we want to preserve, because we don't have a preservation plan and we don't have a survey. No worries, we can continue on moving forward by just lining out what those criteria look like and then just developing a procedure for making a nomination based on the criteria. When I was speaking with
May I make a comment? While it is important that we determine what is important to Cathedral City, please keep in mind that most of the people who prepare applications also want state recognition and finally national recognition, because there are tax benefits for that. So if we focus so much on only local criteria, then we are precluding them from doing this.
And that is correct. That is correct. So when we're looking at this for our regulations and for what's valuable to us, there are layers, right? There's state layers, so there are layers that ensures that you're complying with Section 6.
Right.
And there's the Federal Register as well. It is immensely, and you probably have experience with this, but it's immensely more difficult to get a state designation and tremendously more difficult to get one at the federal level as well.
Actually, it's not that hard to get a state, because what we've done in this application is basically followed what the state requires. And I've done this professionally, and what I see, the changes that I would make to the application are more in the line of making it more easily understood for the public, and for them to be able to understand our terminology, like significance, and what does it really mean to be historic, a historic structure. We can drop out buildings because buildings are also structures. There are a lot of little changes like that that are not terribly important, but that will make it easier for them down the line. In fact, I thought about maybe even having a sheet of a glossary so that the public could understand better and therefore know whether or not they should spend the money for the application.
Charlotte, I don't mean to interrupt, but it sounds like your comments are maybe more suited to the next agenda item, which is the review of the application, because I think they're all, valuable comments, but I just want to make sure we stick with this item, and then we can move on to the application recommendations.
Okay.
So Peter, you had asked for that kind of clarification. Did you?
Yeah, I'm good. And if I cross-reference with our next, I don't know even what to call it, what are we calling it? Next item, agenda item, and the next attached document, part of the criteria is laid out on that document as well. And so one of my concerns was just that criteria from a physical building to a event, a significant emotional, spiritual event that was a part of the community, a turning point, something of that sort, that would also be included as a criteria item. And when I cross-reference to the other attachment, criteria is listed as associated with events that have made a meaningful contribution to the nation, state, or community. So I was just looking for a little more clarification on that. I think our next agenda item will kind of tap into that a little bit more.
Great. I wanted to talk about number 4, so the procedures, that is what we're on, procedures and criteria. Sorry, number 5, the procedures and criteria for action subject to review. So I know one of the things that had come up in the past was the fact that our application and our municipal code is, I believe from what our previous planning liaison had told us, we're the only city in the valley with a historic preservation ordinance that allows someone to remove the historic designation, and that when they cross-referenced the other cities, that none of the other cities did allow that. And I could be wrong, but I just remember Robert saying that when we looked at the fee structure, he gave us a list of the fees for all the other cities, and none of the other cities even had the option of removing historic designation. So there was no fee associated with it because they didn't have that option. So one of the things I wanted to ask is to see, just to confirm if that was the case, and just open the question of whether or not something, once something has been designated historic, while the city could take the designation away, the research and all the work that's gone into it has already proven the site is historic, so it almost seems impractical to then, impractical is the wrong word, but seems strange to, it seems strange to take away the designation while we all still know that the site is actually still historic because the work has already been done to prove that. So I guess I was just looking, I know both of you, I think, have joined since the ordinance was passed, but I would love to find out more about what the thought process was behind why that was included, and whether or not that's something that is still valuable to be in the ordinance since we're so early on. Do we really want to essentially give people the option to remove it down the road?
So we can do some additional research into that. I have worked in another city in the valley, and I recall that there were provisions that allowed a property to be removed from the local register.
Okay.
It required council approval. It was not, say, an easy process, but conditions can change. And what made a site historic could change, or its significance could change. And I think there was that option or opportunity for someone to make that petition, to make that argument that if a property was significantly damaged in a fire, that they would have the ability to redevelop that property, perhaps without that historic designation. I would say that would be an exception, that was not something that I ever saw someone actually pursue. We had discussed it, but I never saw it come through by way of an application. I've worked in another California city too, where there was a similar process where a property could be removed from that local register. Again, it was an exception. It was not something that happened often, but we can do additional research to see just how other cities regulate that in their ordinance, and just what the frequency or what circumstances might compel a city to remove a property from a local register.
Okay, yeah, that would be great, because I think when we're talking about, because even in the staff comments here, it talks about, when is it appropriate to have a certificate of appropriateness? And so I think that kind of then extends to under what circumstances. It can't just be that I bought this house, I want to be able to modify it. I don't want it to be on, considered historic anymore. But like you said, there's no extenuating circumstances, just that the person doesn't want to have to maintain it, right? I think if that's not already in the municipal code, which from my memory, it's not, it just basically says that if someone wishes to remove the designation, they can pay a fee and then have the council review it. But it seems like maybe we should have specific criteria for what would be a reason. Again, just not to encourage that, because I think the whole point of this is we want to encourage people to preserve the city's history.
And certainly we can look at that and see what we can do to build that out. The certificate of appropriateness process, in my past experience, has been instrumental in reviewing additions, reviewing building permits that come in after a property has been designated as a historic resource, and ensuring that that permit preserves the character of that structure. So that is the check and balance to ensure that the designation is maintained over time.
Yeah, and that does concern me personally, just in the idea of what I've worked on in previous committees that I've been on. If someone wanted to come in, or if a building did burn down, and the building was what was declared that historic civic significance, and the developer wanted to come in, to actually hold the developer accountable to maybe replace it in the style of that building or some influence. Just because the building's gone doesn't mean that the historic significance of that land or that space is no longer there. So it does concern me that a future group could come down the road and say, oh, we want to whitewash this part of our history and remove this, we don't want this anymore, and go through a simple process of removing it. So I would be interested in criteria.
I wouldn't characterize it as a simple process, but I think there is a check and balance for the uncertainty of tomorrow and what we don't know and what may transpire.
Unless the land has been declared one of the criteria, if the structure is what designates it as historic property, if the structure is no longer there, it is no longer an historic property. In some cities, historic properties have deteriorated to the point that they no longer have the integrity that's required to be an historic structure. It is possible to decommission them, for lack of a better word, but it's unusual, and I do think we may have given it too much almost encouragement, because normally you can't do that. You can't, just because someone has the whim to decommission an historic property, they would request it from the city, but the city wouldn't allow it.
Well, this is all hypothetical. I mean, there's situations of arson. There's a situation where, say, a building did lose a significant amount of its structure, the historical structure. There was a diner in the Atwater Village of LA where they were developing around that diner. The only thing that was really valid of that structure anymore was really the Googie-style roof, right? And so we required the developer to build that into the new development, right?
It can be reconstructed with like materials.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that it's not, again, my concern would be it's not so easy to say, oh, well, it's deteriorated so much. I mean, there's no value in it anymore. We're just going to bulldoze it over and not have anything that's even an homage to the sort of spirit of the law or the ordinance.
It depends upon which criteria is met for the designation and what is considered significant.
Mm-hmm. So I think the criteria that would require that, I'd be looking at knowing more about that. What would make something so it could be declassified. I'm also curious about number 6. I understand economic hardship in a personal way, let's say, but I don't know what that means in this review. What does it mean in this language and how it applies to a historic designation?
So So certainly, and similarly to the de-designation of a landmark, there needs to be sort of a safety relief valve, because most historic preservation ordinances exist to encourage people to consider preserving their structures. And so if we take away all the ability for them to ever, need to delist them or de-designate them, it makes it very stick-oriented rather than carrot-oriented. So there is a provision, or the state here, and as well as in my previous post, they encouraged us to make sure that we had some sort of a provision for an economic hardship. It can be very simple, and it can be viewed on a case-by-case basis, and I say that sort of in air quotes. I hate that terminology, but really on a case-by-case basis, which makes your job very difficult. Usually it's sent to City Council with your recommendation to make those determinations, but it can also be very complicated, and so that there are a lot of sort of hoops or boxes that an applicant would have to check in order to qualify for either and I'm going to use de-designation, the previous question, as well as an economic hardship. There's pros and cons to either one. It's definitely worthy of some conversation. It doesn't sound like you're ready to address that tonight, but we can certainly bring back more information with regard to that. We had gone from sort of one extreme to a very complicated extreme where people were required to bring in balance sheets and P&Ls and all sorts of things of that nature, which to me and to our state representative, our CLG coordinator, certified local government coordinator, she suggested we get rid of that. That was just too intrusive. And again, if we're trying to encourage people to do this and encourage preservation on a very holistic, realistic platform, then we want it to be less invasive about our methods.
Can you give a real life example? Like, in my mind, I see maybe somebody bought a property and it's already been declared as a historic something, and they come in and say, "Oh, we can't afford it anymore," and so it's a hardship for us. Is that what this is about? Because I don't quite get a clear picture of
I
it.
think more or less, yes. It does come down to, we purchased this property, or we're looking at purchasing this, I'll use vacant land so we can really depersonalize it here, but vacant land within a district, and now we have to build an infill site, and because it's in the district, it needs to comply with the design standards of that district. Well, there will be folks who say, but I want to build it to be 7 stories, and the design guidelines only allowed you to go 2 or 3, and they'll make this argument of, we can't afford this, it won't pencil out, etc. They have to.
What you're referring to is like a historic overlay zone for right, which is different, I think. We don't have those.
We don't have one, but similarly, if it was, say, a structure, we've got a designated structure, and they came in and said, we can't do this. If it came before an application came before the committee, and the committee required A, B, and C, and they were only proposing to do X, Y, and Z, and they made an argument that we can't afford to do A, B, and C that you're requiring us, we want to claim an economic hardship exemption, then the onus would really be on the applicant to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to you all, based on some reasonable, rational, measurable criteria, hopefully without P&Ls and balance sheets and bank statements, something that provides you with enough information so that you would have reasonable certainty to make a determination. It's very difficult to do that, understood, but the point again is to make sure that we have a safety relief valve, because there are cases where something is deteriorated, or they start peeling back layers of plaster and finding out that there might be, who knows, termites or something that's going to be extremely costly, and maybe they can't do what they had intended to do. And so maybe they really just need to do something on an interim basis. So there are ways to handle that, but I think it's best if you have a well laid out criteria, it's more defensible. That's what I'm getting at.
Okay, so that's kind of what I'm looking for. Is there a specific criteria that would be attached to this that would be able
There
to? Okay.
And as
Okay.
we look at the code that you have today, the certificate of appropriateness, it is that check and balance, and this application is heard by the Historic Preservation Committee. This is intended for the alteration the expansion or even the demolition of a structure. And as we look at the code, there are criteria for granting a certificate of appropriateness for, let's say, the modification or the alteration of a structure. But then there also is a section in here that talks about a certificate of appropriateness may still be approved if one of the following findings is made. And this addresses exactly the topics that we've just covered.
Okay.
Where it's a hazard to public safety and the hazard cannot be eliminated by economic means available to the owner. It also talks about an undue hardship to the owner. There's another one in here on the retention of the structure is not in the interest of the majority of the inhabitants of the city. And the last is the structure is a deterrent to a major improvement program which substantially benefits the city. And I have experience with that in the last city I worked in, where a historic resource was proposed to be demoed in order to accommodate an affordable housing development. This structure was significantly deteriorated, and it did not contribute significantly to the historic nature of the city. And the Historic Preservation Committee and that committee approved that certificate of appropriateness for the demolition of that structure to accommodate the affordable housing project. So there is a lot about the future that we don't know. And when we look at the ordinance, I do believe that there are checks and balances built in there to allow for those arguments and those demonstrations to be made. But that is not a staff level decision. That does require a certificate of appropriateness, and that would be heard along with those arguments, those justifications by the committee.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the first three make a lot of sense. The fourth one, I also had an experience in a previous city where a building was designated a historic cultural monument, and then a new development which was slated for the lot where it was a multi-building lot. And the city council did decide that they would allow it to be demolished for a new complex. I will say that while the new complex had some affordable housing, it was not what you're describing, where it was, the building was deteriorating. The building was in perfect condition. It was a perfect example of a very specific architect. And the project that went up, it still hasn't gone up. It's been 5 years. They demolished the site. They demolished the historic thing, and then they decided to sell the property. Nothing's been built there. And even what was supposed to go there was all going to be multi-million-dollar condos with a few affordable units. So I would want to see that last one probably tightened up a little bit, just to ensure that even though there is a check and balance, that the idea of what's beneficial to the city and what's no longer historically contributing are maybe a little better defined, to ensure that we don't end up with something being proposed that maybe. Yeah. Charlotte, do you have any thoughts?
No.
Okay.
Peter?
I'm good on this. If you want to move to the next agenda item,
I just had one other question. I think it's probably under item 4. My understanding is that the code that we have now requires that the property owner be the person to request designation, which is fine. But what about city property? So if there were properties which were city-owned, which have a historic, could potentially have a historic significance, my understanding is there's nothing in the current ordinance that would allow either a member of the public or a member of the city council or anyone else to nominate that property for historic designation. And I'm just wondering if that's something that, if there's a best practice from other cities, or if there's a reason that was left out, or...
The way that we did that previously is that a member of the public or an advocacy group or what have you could approach the board, could actually approach the board, so the Historic Preservation Committee, and ask them to nominate it. I actually recommended against that because I didn't feel that nominations coming without property owner's approval were appropriate. So if I'm John Q. Citizen and I want to have a site recommended for designation, I would approach the city and potentially bring it to city council, bring it to the city manager. I think just outlining a process for doing something like that would probably alleviate that, but that would be my understanding of If someone wanted to do that, that's how they would need to approach that. If someone asked me that question, that's how I would advise them.
So but I think currently in the ordinance, there's nothing that even allows for that process to happen. I think city property is sort of excluded, or
I wouldn't go that far.
it's just not mentioned.
It says owner, and I think we'd have to interpret what that means and whether council as a body could provide that direction. Typically, real estate transactions, that authority is granted to city council, so I would say that that would be an action of city council to provide that direction. However, I do have experience in other cities where they have had city-owned properties, city-owned structures that have been designated as a local resource. We can look to those cities as examples of alternate language that provides clarity on how that could be designated.
I think that as committee members, we could approach an owner and suggest that their property meets our criteria, but I would be very careful about one of us actually proposing it. There are political reasons and liability reasons that, for example, if the owner wasn't the least bit interested in it, they might feel like they were being pressured by the city government, even though we're not government.
I agree. And to clarify, I was answering the question
Yeah, we're
that
just
really was
talking about
talking about
city
city-owned property. So
yeah.
property owned by
Okay.
the city.
Yeah.
And in my experience, typically the purchase, the sale, the granting of easements, that authority is typically with city council.
With the city, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I stand corrected.
Just as a clarification point with the city, right? What if 50 years from now, as an example locally right here, the city or someone in the city thought, you know what? Our amphitheater's pretty cool. It's been with us for 60 years now. We want to designate that as a historical site. We want to preserve that as an amphitheater for future generations, right? How would that be championed?
I think right now, the way the code reads, that's the owner. So that would be the city that would have to initiate that process. Whether that's council, the city manager, I think that's perhaps open for interpretation, and we can work to clarify that. We can look at other cities that have that. There's one not too far from us in Palm Desert where they do have city-owned properties, city-owned buildings that are designated on their local register. So
Yeah.
we can take a look at those ordinances to
That would be
see
great.
what clarity we can add to
Yeah.
the ordinance.
I know Rancho Mirage has a park, and they have one of the first stone buildings, houses that was built in Rancho Mirage, and they have it in their park, and that's considered a historically protected site. It's on city land, it's city-owned, it's designated that. I would be really curious if there's a way to have some sort of inclusion, probably like just a couple sentences, literally, but it might be a nice thing to have that as future possibilities.
The city fills out our application.
Right, exactly. But who then pays that fee, right? And who is this? Like, who from the city has the ability to do that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Just proposing a clarification of, does it start with the city manager? Is it a motion at city council? Can an individual citizen bring it to their council member? I mean, just some clarity, because the way I read the ordinance was that city property was basically excluded because there is no owner per se. I mean, there is, the city owns the property, but it didn't read to me like city property could be included. So I think it's important to make that clear and figure out a process.
Maybe just to clarify that it could be publicly owned or privately owned.
Right.
The city that I came from previously, our first designation was public owned, and it was our impetus for our entire ordinance. So that was the driver of everything. So yeah, it can be done, and it's a great thing if you've got good resources behind it.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? This complex maybe one day will be. This was a significant moment in our city history, right? The building of this structure.
Great.
Yeah.
Any other comments on any of these other kind of,
I have a question. I have a lot of small changes that really I don't think we want to go through one by one. Could I send my suggestions to you?
Yes, please.
Who should I send it to?
You can send them to me.
Okay.
okay, so are we ready to move on to the next agenda item? Yes, okay. Okay, so next agenda item is the review of the historic preservation application. There was a staff report and then also the actual updated application. Did anyone have questions about the staff report, or would you guys like to present kind of your approach to this?
So I listened at the last meeting, took a lot of notes, and I made effort to incorporate that into the application. This is a working draft. This is not meant to be a final work product. There's a lot of formatting issues in here. I recognize that when we uploaded this to the packet. The formatting got a little messed up, so I apologize for that. But what I've tried to do is incorporate the ideas and the suggestions that came out of the last meeting into this. And I think from my standpoint, really trying to make this a more iterative process, because I recognize that was a major failure with the one application that we reviewed, where we took it in as staff. We spent a lot of time as staff looking at this. We brought it forward at a public hearing to the Historic Preservation Committee without including the committee in some of those early discussions on what material really would be required as part of that application.
It was a first draft.
It was a first draft. It was a learning experience. I really like the idea of including the committee in identifying and setting the expectations for each application as it comes in, because they're all different. And we could spend a lot of time trying to really hone the application requirements, but every application is different. The circumstances for them are unique. And I think that really warrants conversation, it warrants discussion, and perhaps we lower the bar a little bit with a preliminary application form and share the criteria, share what's in the ordinance and the code, because that's the standard that will have to be met for the designation, but we're inviting someone to come in and have a conversation. And we can take that preliminary application forward to the committee for review. We can work with the committee to identify what additional studies, what additional documentation, what additional resources are needed in order to investigate the application. In my opinion, that was missing from that last application. And the code gives staff authority to do all of those things, but I think including the committee in that discussion will make this a more well-rounded application. And when we do schedule it for public hearing, you're not left asking, well, what about this? And why didn't staff or the applicant prepare this information? I think it'll get the material, get the information that you as the committee are looking for in that public hearing. And I always like the thought of being up front with an applicant, setting the expectations early on so they know what they're getting into. And we've established that clearly for each application on its individual merits. So that's a change that I've incorporated into this. You also see that the criteria are on the first page of the application form, trying to make that clear. And I've deleted the requirement for the applicant to prepare the mailing labels and a lot of the other material. For other land development applications, we're doing the same. We're taking that responsibility on as city staff, recognizing that it could be months, if not longer, before an application is ready for that public hearing. So I think we're trying to focus on getting an application in, focusing on what those submittal requirements are, what the expectations are for that application, and then we can fill in those details later on. There was discussion at the last meeting about consultants. So we did identify the CRIS consultant list and have worked that in.
Good.
And we've mentioned the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties as a guideline for the designation of a historic site. So I'm sure there's other changes that I've made in here, and I apologize that you don't have a red line version of this, but I hope that this starts moving us in a direction that's more consistent with your expectations on the application.
Yeah, yeah. it's-
Yeah, I think you did a great job interpreting what we were asking for and kind of incorporating it in. I mean, I just personally feel like just having that criteria there on the first page is where someone can, because I think that's what we learned from the first application that we had, that we weren't quite sure which criteria they were kind of claiming under. So I think that, and maybe it was multiple, right? So I think having this list really hones the applicant in on why are you applying for this, and then explain it, and then everything flows from there. It really focuses them. So I thought that was great.
My curiosity is, should the removal or downgrade of historic designation be on the same application?
That's why we were discussing it in the previous.
Should that be there?
It gives it a lot of prominence. That's why I was asking. And
Not only you give it prominence, but it's a completely, you're establishing criteria, and you're establishing requirements and all that type of stuff. It's almost like that's a different application. Like now, instead of telling us why your property is important, tell us why it isn't. The language would be very different for that kind of, it's almost like taking the application and just switching some of the language around, right? Let me prove to you now why, here's a study, here's stuff showing, here's existing pictures of why the property should be downlisted. Here is, that type of stuff. It should be on.
Yes, and let me go a step further than that. Since you mentioned that, the certificate of appropriateness is also different.
yes.
Because that is for a property that has already been designated. And what you're really asking, what are the alterations, the modifications that you're proposing to that structure, and how are you retaining the character? So there are different questions that we would be asking through a certificate of appropriateness application. So I think that's an excellent comment, and that's something that we can work to refine, how we can separate that. I think one of the reasons that the removal or downgrade of a historic designation is on here separate from a certificate of appropriateness, it actually requires a certificate of appropriateness, but it's a separate fee, and that fee was established through the fee resolution. I'm not sure those checkboxes mean much in the long run, because we are moving forward with electronic forms, and all of these will be available through our Citizen Self-Service, CSS, on the web portal. And someone's not going to be checking that box in the future, but they're going to be selecting an application from a drop-down, and that'll be generating the fees. But I think you have an excellent point, though, in terms of how we structure the applications to elicit the information that we need in order to review the application. And both of those, the certificate of appropriateness, as well as that sub-application, the removal of a historic designation, that requires different information than what we were asking for.
It's almost as if it's in the same form, it should say something like, skip to page 4, right? And fill that out.
I was just looking through how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation, and there's nothing in there at all about, it's a National Register bulletin, and there's nothing about decommissioning at all. I think what John was thinking about when he did this was more addressing alteration, and there is provision, of course, for changing the structure in the sense that termites ate the fascia, and they have to use like materials. So, there are things, but new construction and demolition, I don't know that that's really appropriate in this application.
I agree.
take that direction.
I do think we might need to put a little bit in about historic districts. We haven't specified, well, a couple of the things I was going to suggest is that, for instance, color photographs of the exterior and interior, they're not necessarily needed, but they might be. And we need to have those on a CD, DVD, or flash drive containing all the nomination documents, the photos, and those photos have to be in TIFF or JPEG, that sort of thing. And for districts with multiple owners, we need to include the names, addresses, emails, and phone numbers of each owner.
We don't currently have the ability for districts in the code, do we?
I don't see it in the code.
Yeah, I believe that was deliberately excluded from what I've heard from the deliberation process. So currently, there is no ability to establish a historic district in the.
Why not?
I don't know.
I don't know. I've just heard from people who were involved in that it was one of the more contentious things, and so they tried to get past, I think, and include everything that was less, that everyone agreed on, and tried to come to a consensus. So.
What I do know about districts, so the code doesn't include a provision for that, but what typically happens before you establish a district, we could have it in the code, but usually what happens before you can establish a district is you have a survey. You'll usually have some idea of where your resources might be and start with a survey in that area, dig a little bit deeper and find out if that area would then qualify as a district. And then there's some sort of a provision, whether it be 90%, 50%, 66% of the property owners within that district would agree to it before you make that designation of a district. Exactly. It can be a very contentious thing because once you're in the district, you've got to comply with all those rules and regulations.
Yep.
And what I have found is that everyone likes to know the information about their property, so they're supportive of the survey, but they're not necessarily supportive of the district designation unless you have a really strong grouping of resources. So it's been difficult. I don't know what our resource map looks like. I know where some of them might be, but I don't have any idea, anything beyond that.
But
I know.
go ahead.
I know there are people who are interested in applying for that, and they may not know exactly what they would have to do that. And I would say that they could apply for it, and then they will find out that they had. We don't state anything about what the criteria for it is, like everyone in the housing area must agree. If we had that on an application, then they could look at the application and tell that they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that need to be in the ordinance first?
That would be my suggestion, is that if there was a constituency that was interested in creating a historic district within Cathedral City, the first step would be making that appeal to the committee and council to amend the ordinance to create that district process. And certainly that's in the purview of the committee as you're reviewing the ordinance. If that is one of the changes that you would like to undertake, we can look at that. I have experience in another city here in California that had a historic district, and there are provisions, just like Ms. Schultz indicated, that there's a process. It requires public engagement, requires a neighborhood meeting, it requires individualized notice to all of the property owners within that district. So there is a way to do it.
And then it also requires some sort of oversight board moving forward to accept applications for people who want to be able to make changes, to their homes, all that sort of thing. That's either a city or a community or a hybrid kind of
You got it.
committee, so, yeah.
And there's different types of districts. Like we, as a historic committee, would be interested in a historic district, right? But there's also districts that aren't historic. There's districts that are design districts. There's districts that are entertainment or something like that. Like
Those would, I think, fall under the normal.
those would fall under the normal
Those fall
code.
under our criteria.
But to have maybe in the application the potential for a historic district and why would probably be good. I also wanted to point out on page 3 of 7, the application agreement, I'm assuming that when it says, I herewith deposit, I am herewith depositing, and a $sign and a blank line, that we would know what that amount is based on the top, the first page where it says historic designation of $99 or certificate of appropriateness for 17. I wonder if that would be, like, should there be a box, like check, I hereby, and I'm checking the box of the 99, I'm checking the box of the, and just putting that number.
So this
in the
section can be greatly simplified. I'll start with that. And as we move to electronic forms, I think this is something that's going to look very different than it does today. So in our department, we have two types of applications. You have flat fees and then you have deposit-based accounts. It's my understanding that these are flat fees, especially for the historic designation and the certificate of appropriateness, that these were set intentionally as maximums. These are not deposit-based accounts. So the language that you see in here is reflecting more the deposit-based accounts for land development applications. So we will revise that language and simplify that greatly.
Right, I'm imagining on the CSS, it's a form and you actually check this box and it's gonna automatically fill in that dollar amount, right? Or check all two
I think
boxes.
what
or-
this is acknowledging is that you're
Right.
paying an application fee.
Okay.
This is a discretionary review process, and you agree to the legal language that's in it.
Got it.
Right, and like you said, I mean, it says if the costs are more than the deposit fee, I shall pay the balance due, but we already decided that that $99 is the maximum. They're not going
That's
to
the
be,
fee.
unless, except for the thing that you did add at the beginning, which said that additional research might accrue, additional surveys, studies, or investigations. But beyond that, it is what it is. It's
Right.
And I brought up two things on piggybacking onto each other. I think it would be interesting to also have a way to put into the form if it is a district of some sort of historic area, district, something. The language kind of alludes to it, but it would be nice if it was a little more specific.
So my hesitancy on the district is solely that it's not in the ordinance, and that's an instance where the code language should lead and the application should support it. So if there
Right.
is a desire to support the creation of historic districts, modifications to the application form, it's probably not the right place to start.
Okay.
We could go back to the ordinance and look at what's missing, and that's something that we can come back to the committee with at a future meeting, at our next meeting. We can share with you examples of historic district code language from other cities to say this is what's missing if we wanted to go down that road and look at creating a process that would allow a constituency to come in and say, we'd like to create a historic district in our neighborhood.
Yeah, such as like some of the Lawrence Crossley developments, right? We already recognize his significance, we already recognize the political impact that he made, the racial impact, all that type of stuff that he created in the city, so we recognize that. But do we have actually, maybe one of his developments or communities or a group of houses or something that then supports that, right? So if that's a future potential, right, I think that would be a really nice thing to have for future. I get you're saying there's no ordinance for it, but coming down the road, there might be
I
a
think
need.
we've noted the interest, and we will come back with some ideas.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else on this item? Okay, so.
It's very well done, just as an FYI. The improvements are enormous, so thank you.
The next item on the agenda is discussion on future agenda items. Is there anything that anyone would like to put on a future agenda? Charlotte?
Well, I kind of threw out that idea of design
Yeah, well, I think
overlays.
Other beyond them, that's a continuation, I think, of today's agenda item.
Yeah.
Let me ask the committee, is this helpful? I want to make sure that we're on the right trajectory, that we're meeting expectations, and that we're continuing to make steps in the right direction. And if so, we'll agendize the application form and the ordinance again. We'll look to bring back some additional material and continue the discussions at the next meeting, if that's
I think so.
supported.
Personally, yeah, I think this has been great, really.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Okay. Thank you.
We
I'm
are
keeping-
making progress.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other from the committee? No? Next agenda item is staff comments. Any staff comments?
Not this evening.
Okay. Committee member comments? Peter?
No.
My first meeting, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to learn from you guys. I'm very grateful to contribute to the city as much as I can, and just wanted to express that gratitude.
Thank you.
Peter, I think it might help you if you go online to the Park Service, National Park Service, and read some of the information about historic properties, and it would, I think, give you a greater understanding of the process. I think it's very helpful at this point that you don't know the details, because you give us the perspective of the public at this point. I mean, I know you have experience in city government, but as far as historic preservation,
I actually have some experience with historic preservation as I
Yeah.
lived in a district and I had a house, and so
Yeah.
I knew all the legal things, the tax things, and all that type of
Yeah.
stuff, but I appreciate the recommendation.
yeah, I just think these National Register bulletins, you can actually order them from the government forms site. And they're definitely written for the public. And historic only means older than 50 years.
Yeah.
Actually, historic in this field refers to not prehistoric. And historic occurred at different times in the US, depending upon when we first had contact with written peoples who kept written documents, because Native Americans or the indigenous didn't have writing. So in California, it's circa 1550, but I don't think we have anything that's that old.
I just wanted to say, I heard that the first property that was designated got their plaque, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not a future agenda item or necessarily a request, but I thought I was a little disappointed that that wasn't announced, and there was no, I know they had a private, event, which is completely fine, but I think it would be nice if the city would let the committee know and the public know that a property has been designated, and just maybe give us the opportunity to, I don't know when the actual plaque went in, but it would have been nice to see the plaque go in, since it was the first one of the city, and I was just, to be honest, a little disappointed that there was no city event. They could have been separate from their private event, but
There was
I'm wondering if maybe there should be
Multiple
something moving forward.
reasons and circumstances that it was not more pronounced. But I will work to see what we can do to have some recognition, some acknowledgement of that. I believe the plaque went up about a month ago, thereabouts. So I'll see if I can follow up and provide some more answers for the committee.
Yeah, that would be great. It'd just be nice to be able to see it when it happens.
I agree.
Any other committee member comments? Okay, then we can move to adjournment. Does someone like to move to adjourn?
Oh, you don't need to, you can just adjourn. At 6:03, the meeting has been adjourned.
Perfect. Thank you so much.